The flight attendant thought the passenger was joking. Whatever happens, those two passengers never speak to each other. She looked toward the two seats. 12C, 19A. A businessman reading a financial magazine. A young woman wearing headphones while staring out the window. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't looked at each other. They probably didn't even know the other existed. She looked back at the man standing beside her. "I'm sorry." The passenger reached into his jacket. He opened a leather wallet just enough for her to see the badge inside. Federal Air Marshal. He closed it immediately. "Listen carefully. I'm not asking you to watch them. I'm asking you to make sure they never meet." The flight attendant lowered her voice. "Sir, they're complete strangers." The Air Marshal looked at Seat 12C, then at Seat 19A. His expression never changed. "I know. That's exactly why I'm worried." 43 minutes earlier, most passengers believed airport security ended at the checkpoint. It didn't. For people like Daniel Mercer, security started there. 21 years. More than 4,000 flights. Daniel had arrested hijackers, violent fugitives, organized criminals. And once, a man who tried to open an emergency exit over the Atlantic. None of them had worried him as much as ordinary people. Because dangerous people rarely looked dangerous anymore. They looked tired, polite, forgettable. Exactly the kind of passengers nobody remembered after landing. Daniel stepped into the boarding gate carrying nothing more than a backpack and yesterday's newspaper. Nobody looked at him twice, exactly the way he preferred. His assignment that evening was simple. Domestic flight. 2 hours. No known threats. Random deployment. He wasn't protecting someone. He wasn't escorting a prisoner. As far as everyone else knew, he was just another passenger flying home. He scanned the gate while pretending to read the departure screen. Families, business travelers, students. A retired couple arguing over boarding groups. Nothing unusual. Then, his eyes stopped. Seat 12. C. Middle-aged. Dark blue jacket. Carry-on backpack. No checked luggage. Perfectly ordinary. Daniel watched him board. Nothing. No nervous movements. No repeated checking. No hidden communication. The man simply walked onto the aircraft. Daniel almost looked away. Almost. Because at that exact moment, another passenger entered the boarding lane. Seat 19A. A woman, late 20s.
Gray sweater.
Small shoulder bag. Coffee in her left hand. Phone in her right. She never looked toward 12C. 12C never looked toward her. But they slowed down at exactly the same moment. Not because of another passenger, not because boarding stopped. They simply matched each other's pace. Less than 2 seconds. Then both continued walking. Daniel frowned. Coincidence? Probably. He followed them on board. Cabin crew greeted everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Right side, please. Everything moved normally. 12C reached his row first, placed his backpack overhead, sat down, opened a magazine. 19A arrived several rows behind, stored her bag, sat beside the window, put on her headphones, never looked forward, never looked back. Daniel took seat 15D, perfect view of both. He unfolded yesterday's newspaper. He never read a single word. Instead, he watched reflections in the cabin windows. Most surveillance training focused on where people looked. Daniel had learned something different. People lied with their eyes. Their bodies rarely did. The aircraft door closed. Safety demonstration began. Passengers ignored it. Some checked messages. Some adjusted seatbelts. Some closed their eyes. Daniel watched only 2 people, halfway through the safety briefing. 12C reached for his seatbelt. At that exact moment, 19A adjusted hers too. Neither movement was unusual. What bothered Daniel was the timing, perfectly synchronized. Not identical, not rehearsed, just too close. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. A flight attendant walked down the aisle. Would anyone like to gate check a larger bag? Nobody answered. Daniel noticed 12C glance toward the front galley. A fraction of a second later, 19A glanced toward the same galley. Neither looked at each other. Neither smiled. Neither nodded. Nothing happened. Daniel quietly wrote 2 words inside his newspaper.
Synchronized attention.
Then he stopped writing, because he suddenly realized both passengers had looked away at exactly the same time. He folded the newspaper, closed his eyes, and listened, not to the engines, not to the announcements, to the cabin. People always made noise before takeoff. Children complained. Someone laughed. Someone called home one last time. Someone searched for earbuds they had already lost. The cabin sounded alive, except around rows 12 through 19. That section felt controlled, as though 2 people were waiting for something. Without knowing, they were waiting together. Daniel opened his eyes again. The captain's voice filled the cabin. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. The engines began to roar. Passengers settled back into their seats. The aircraft accelerated. Tires left the runway. Everyone looked out the windows. Everyone. Except seats 12C and 19A. Neither watched the takeoff. Both watched the aisle. Daniel felt the first real knot in his stomach. He had seen that before. only once, 21 years earlier. And 3 people had died because nobody noticed it in time. He stood up. The nearest flight attendant looked confused. "Sir, the seatbelt sign is still on." Daniel leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't argue. I'm the Federal Air Marshal." She froze. Daniel looked past her, toward rows 12 and 19, then quietly said, "Whatever happens." Those 2 passengers never speak to each other. The flight attendant stared at Daniel. "You think they're together?" "I don't know." "You think they're dangerous?" "I don't know." "Then what exactly am I looking at?" Daniel glanced toward rows 12 and 19. "A pattern." The flight attendant frowned. "That's not an answer." "It never is." She looked at the 2 passengers again. The businessman had returned to his magazine. The woman was still looking out the window. "I've worked flights for 12 years, she whispered. "They look completely normal." Daniel nodded. "They do. That's what makes them worth watching." The aircraft leveled off. The seatbelt sign switched off. A familiar chime echoed through the cabin. Almost immediately, passengers began standing. Someone headed toward the restroom. A father reached for a backpack. 2 college students changed seats. Normal. Every flight looked like this. Except rows 12 through 19. Neither passenger moved. Neither reached for a bag. Neither called a flight attendant. They simply waited. Daniel folded his newspaper. "Begin beverage service." The flight attendant looked confused. "I thought you wanted me watching them." "I do." "Then why start service?" "Because people reveal themselves when they're interrupted." She hesitated, then nodded. The service cart rolled into the aisle. "Coffee?"
Tea?
"Water." Passengers answered absent-mindedly. When the cart reached 12C, the businessman smiled politely. "Water, please." Nothing unusual. The cart continued. 7 rows later, it reached 19A. The woman removed one earbud. "Water, please." Same answer, same tone. The flight attendant froze for half a second. She hadn't realized it before. Daniel had. The cart moved on. Halfway down the cabin, Daniel quietly spoke again. "Turn around." "What?" "Go back." The flight attendant pushed the cart toward the front once more. This time, she deliberately skipped seat 12C. No reaction. She skipped 19A. No reaction. She continued serving everyone else. Still, nothing. Daniel watched carefully. Most passengers eventually waved. "Excuse me. Can I get a drink?" Neither of them did. Almost as though they had expected to be skipped. The flight attendant returned. I don't understand. Daniel asked one question. How many passengers asked where the cart went? She thought about it. 4. And those 2? They said nothing. Daniel nodded. Exactly. She crossed her arms. People miss drink service all the time. They do. So they both noticed. But neither acknowledged it. She looked back again. You really think that's connected? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a folded photograph from his wallet. It showed the cabin of another aircraft. Years earlier. Emergency lights, oxygen masks, police officers. The flight attendant looked closer. What happened? Daniel took the photograph back. I ignored a pattern. Silence. I told myself, they're probably strangers. He looked toward Seattle 12C. I was wrong. The woman lowered her voice. What did they do? Daniel slipped the photograph back into his wallet. I'll tell you after we land. If we land. She stared at him. You're serious. I've never been more serious. At that moment, the businessman in 12C finally stood up. Not quickly. Calmly. He stepped into the aisle. The flight attendant instinctively moved toward him. Sir, can I help you? He smiled. Just stretching my legs. Daniel stood too, without taking his eyes off the man. Please remain near your seat, sir. The passenger looked surprised. Is that a rule? No. Then why? Daniel smiled politely. Because I'm asking. The man studied him for several seconds. Then, without another word, he sat back down. Daniel remained standing. The flight attendant whispered, You think he recognized you? Daniel slowly shook his head. No. He looked toward Seat 19A. The woman had lowered her headphones. For the first time since boarding, she wasn't looking out the window. She was watching. Seat 12C, only for a second. Then she looked away again. Daniel felt his heartbeat slow. Not faster. Slower. Because now, he wasn't looking at one coincidence anymore. He was looking at a sequence, and sequences were never accidents. Daniel remained standing. The businessman looked back at his magazine. The woman returned to her headphones. The cabin breathed again. Passengers laughed. Coffee cups rattled against the service cart. A baby cried somewhere near the rear galley. Everything looked normal. Daniel hated normal. Because normal was often the last thing people remembered before something wasn't. The lead flight attendant quietly approached him. Captain wants to speak with you. Daniel nodded. Keep serving. She looked surprised. Now? Especially now. The cockpit door opened only long enough for Daniel to enter. Seconds later, It was locked again. Captain Rachel Collins didn't waste time. I've been told you've restricted 2 passengers. I have. Why? I believe they're coordinating. The captain folded her arms. Do you have evidence? No. Threat intelligence? No. Behavioral trigger? Several. She waited. Daniel continued. Not one. A collection. The first officer looked over from the instruments. What kind of collection? Daniel pointed toward the cabin. 2 strangers. They've never acknowledged each other. They've never spoken. They've never looked directly at each other. The first officer frowned. Isn't that good? Daniel slowly shook his head. No. It's perfect. Silence. Captain Collins looked unconvinced. You think they're pretending not to know each other? I think they're working very hard to look like strangers. The captain sighed. I've flown for 18 years. I've seen hijack attempts, medical emergencies, bomb threats. I've never diverted an aircraft because 2 passengers drank water. Daniel almost smiled. Neither have I. That answer lingered in the cockpit. The captain noticed. You've seen this before. Daniel didn't answer. You said that earlier. Still nothing. Finally, he spoke. 7 years ago. Denver. Evening flight. 2 passengers. They never spoke. They never looked at each other. They boarded separately. They left separately. They were searched separately. The first officer leaned forward. What happened? Daniel stared through the cockpit door. They were testing us. Silence. Captain Collins frowned. Testing? They wanted to know whether we'd notice. Did you? I didn't. The cockpit remained quiet. Daniel continued. Nothing happened. The aircraft landed. They walked away. 3 months later. The same 2 men boarded another flight. Captain Collins' expression changed. And Daniel answered without emotion. That crew didn't notice them either. Nobody asked what happened next. They didn't need to. The captain broke the silence. So, what are you asking me to do? Nothing dramatic. No diversion. No emergency. No announcements. What then? Daniel looked directly at her. I want control. What kind? No passenger changes seats. No one gathers near rows 12 through 19. If either passenger stands, I know before they take 2 steps. Captain Collins slowly nodded. I can do that. The first officer looked back toward the cockpit door. What if you're wrong? Daniel answered immediately. Then everyone gets home late by 10 minutes. And if you're right? Daniel didn't answer. The cockpit door opened. He stepped back into the cabin. Everything looked exactly the same. Too exactly. The businessman had turned another page. The woman had closed her eyes. Daniel walked toward the rear galley. Without looking at either passenger, he quietly asked the lead flight attendant, "Who watched the aisle while I was gone?" She blinked. No one. Daniel stopped walking. "What?" "You told me to continue service." "So we did." He slowly turned back toward the cabin. For less than 2 minutes, neither he nor the lead flight attendant had been watching rows 12 through 19. He looked first at seat 12C. The businessman smiled politely, still reading. Then, seat 19. The headphones were still on, eyes still closed. Nothing had changed. Nothing, except one detail. The woman's coffee cup was gone. Daniel frowned. He looked at the service cart. No empty cups. No collection tray. He looked beneath her seat. Nothing. He turned toward the flight attendant. "Did you take her cup?" "No." "Did another attendant?" "No." Daniel looked back at Seat 19A. The woman slowly opened her eyes. She noticed him looking. Then, without the slightest change in expression, she raised her right hand. Inside it was the coffee cup. She had been holding it the entire time, perfectly still, hidden below the armrest, for nearly 2 minutes. Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, recognition. He had seen that before. Someone trying not to leave evidence of moving. The woman smiled politely. "Is something wrong?" Daniel smiled back. "No." Not yet. But inside, he had just crossed the line. This was no longer a collection of coincidences. For the first time since boarding, Daniel believed. He was watching 2 professionals.
The woman slowly took a sip of her coffee,
Then placed the cup on the tray table. Nothing about her movements appeared unusual. That was exactly the problem. The lead flight attendant stepped beside him. "You're certain now, aren't you?" Daniel answered without taking his eyes off row 19. "No." She looked surprised. "I thought you just proved it." Daniel quietly shook his head. "I proved nothing. I only eliminated another coincidence." The flight attendant sighed. "Then what are we waiting for?" Daniel finally looked at her. "The mistake." "What mistake?" "Everyone makes one." He returned to Seat 15D. For the next 15 minutes, he did absolutely nothing. He didn't stare. He didn't write notes. He didn't follow either passenger with his eyes. Instead, he became another traveler. He adjusted his seat, closed his newspaper, looked out the window, ordered a bottle of water. Professional surveillance wasn't about watching. It was about never looking like you were watching. The aircraft entered a patch of light turbulence. Seatbelt signs illuminated again. Passengers groaned. Someone laughed. Plastic cups rattled. The captain's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll remain seated for a few minutes while we pass through some rough air. The cabin settled. Daniel didn't care about the turbulence. He cared about reactions. Most people instinctively looked outside. Others checked the overhead bins. Several passengers grabbed their armrests. Seat 12 looked toward the rear galley. Seat 19A looked toward the forward galley. 1 second later, both returned to facing forward. Another synchronized scan, different directions. Same purpose. Daniel leaned toward the flight attendant. They're counting. Counting what? I don't know yet. 5 minutes passed. The turbulence ended. Seatbelt signs switched off. Immediately. 3 passengers stood. One headed toward the restroom. Another stretched near row 16. A teenager waited in the aisle for the lavatory. Normal. Completely normal. Until the businessman in 12C stood as well. Not toward the restroom, not toward the galley. He simply stood as though waiting. The woman in 19A remained seated, looking out the window. Daniel didn't move. The flight attendant whispered, "Should I stop him?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I need to know what he's waiting for." 30 seconds. The businessman never took a step. He simply stood in the aisle. Then, without warning, the woman removed one headphone. Only one. She never looked at him. She never spoke. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her sweater. The businessman sat down. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. The flight attendant frowned. "What was that?" "I don't know. But it wasn't random." Captain Collins called from the interphone. "Daniel." He answered quietly. "Go ahead. We're 25 minutes from landing." "Understood. I need a decision." Daniel looked toward the cabin. "I know. Either they're harmless, or they aren't." "Exactly. We can't delay forever." Daniel remained silent. Captain Collins spoke again. "If you believe they're a threat, I'll divert. If you don't, I'm landing on schedule." The line went quiet. Daniel answered, "Give me 5 more minutes." He stood again. This time, he walked directly to row 19. The woman smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Daniel smiled back. "I hope so." He pointed toward the empty aisle. "Would you mind stepping into the galley for a moment?" She looked genuinely confused. Why? I have a security question. She hesitated, only briefly, then stood. At that exact moment, Seat 12C looked up from his magazine. For the first time since boarding, his eyes followed her. Not Daniel. Her. Less than a second. Then, he immediately looked back down. Daniel saw it. The businessman had broken the pattern. He had acknowledged her existence, instinctively, before he could stop himself. Daniel thanked the woman. You can return to your seat. She sat down. The businessman never turned another page. The magazine remained open. Upside down. Daniel slowly walked back toward the front galley. The flight attendant was already waiting. You saw it. I did. They know each other. Daniel looked toward row 12. No. She blinked. What? They know. That the other one exists. That's different. The flight attendant stared at him. I don't understand. Daniel lowered his voice. I think they boarded this aircraft prepared. Never to recognize each other. He looked toward both rows. But habits are stronger than plans. Captain Collins' voice came through the interphone again. Daniel. He picked it up. Yes. I need your answer. Daniel looked once more at seats 12 and 19, then quietly said, I have enough. The captain took a breath. What do you need from me? Daniel's answer came immediately. Don't land until I separate them. She looked through the cockpit door, toward the quiet cabin, then back at Daniel. How? Daniel already had a plan. Make an announcement. What kind? Tell the passengers we'll be holding outside the airport for 10 minutes because of congestion. There isn't any congestion. I know. But they don't. The captain studied him for a moment, then reached for the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to enter a short holding pattern due to traffic near the airport. We apologize for the brief delay. Most passengers sighed. Some rolled their eyes. A few returned to their books. Nothing unusual. Daniel wasn't watching them. He was watching rows 12 through 19. The businessman closed his magazine. The woman slowly removed both headphones. For the first time, they reacted at the same moment. Daniel quietly spoke into the interphone. They weren't expecting a delay. Captain Collins answered. You sound relieved. I am. Why? Because real strangers don't share disappointment. The lead flight attendant approached. What now? Daniel handed her 2 boarding passes. They're blank. I know. I need your help. She frowned. Do what? Tell the passenger in 12C we've upgraded him. There isn't an upgrade. I know. And the woman? Tell her we're moving her because of a seat maintenance issue. The flight attendant looked confused. To where? Daniel smiled slightly. Opposite directions. 5 minutes later, the flight attendant stopped beside 12C. Sir, we've had a last-minute seat change. The businessman looked surprised. For me? Yes, sir. He glanced down the cabin, only for a fraction of a second, toward row 19. Then immediately looked back at the attendant. Daniel saw it. The man hadn't looked to see where he was moving. He'd looked to see whether someone else was. The second flight attendant approached the woman. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we'll need to reseat you. She smiled politely. No problem. As she stood, Daniel watched both passengers. Neither acknowledged the other. Neither smiled. Neither spoke, but both waited, as though expecting the other person to move first. Daniel quietly exhaled. There it was. Not communication, expectation. The passengers were escorted in opposite directions. 12C moved toward the rear. 19A moved toward the front. 23 rows apart, no line of sight, no shared aisle, no visual contact. Daniel returned to seat 15D. For the first time since boarding, he relaxed. The lead flight attendant sat beside him. That's it. That's it. You aren't arresting them. No. You aren't searching them. No. She looked genuinely puzzled. What if they're innocent? Daniel answered honestly. They might be. And if they aren't? They just lost something they spent the entire flight protecting. The aircraft began its descent. This time, only one passenger watched the aisle. The other watched the window. The pattern was gone. Daniel noticed it immediately. He smiled for the first time that evening. Captain Collins called. We're cleared to land. Daniel looked outside. Go ahead. The aircraft touched down without incident. No disturbance. No panic. No arrests. Passengers applauded softly. One by one, they left the aircraft. The businessman exited through the forward door. The woman remained seated until nearly everyone else had left. They never looked at each other. Not once. 2 weeks later, Daniel sat inside a conference room at the Federal Air Marshal Service. An investigator closed the final report. No weapons. No explosives. No criminal record. No communication between the passengers. He looked at Daniel. You delayed cabin service. You requested seat changes. You recommended a holding pattern, based entirely on behavioral analysis. Correct. The investigator leaned back. So tell us, were they working together? Daniel looked at the report, then quietly answered, "I don't know." Another investigator frowned. "Then why did you separate them?" Daniel closed the folder. "Because after I did, they stopped behaving like partners." Silence. "But you still can't prove they were." "No." "So officially, nothing happened." Daniel nodded. "Officially, nothing happened." 3 months later, a new Air Marshal trainee asked Daniel a question during class. "How do you know when two strangers aren't really strangers?" Daniel looked around the room, then answered with the same calm voice he had used on the aircraft. "You don't. You watch them. You wait. And if you're lucky, they'll eventually stop pretending." The trainee raised another hand. "And if they never do?" Daniel picked up his notebook, walked toward the classroom door. Without turning around, he gave the last lesson of his career. "The people who scare me aren't the ones trying to hide." He paused. "They're the ones trying to hide from each other." Daniel Mercer retired 6 weeks later. His final case remains classified. The official report contains only one sentence that has never been removed. It reads, "Some flights land safely because two strangers never had the chance to say hello."